Hey everybody, welcome back to another 10-minute Marvel video. I'm Petter, and today I'm going to be talking about I believe it was Variety article that Kevin Feige was talking about some potential changes to how things are being done in the MCU. And generally, I think it's good. You can hear our full conversation on it and on the podcast, though this one's probably going to be a little bit more clear because I was coming up with my analogies as I was going along on that podcast. But it's good to hear both kind of Greg and my thoughts on it, so definitely check that out. I'll let you know where the podcast can be found here at the end, though, spoiler, one of the spots is here on YouTube. So, let's talk about what Kevin Feige was talking about. Probably the biggest one, and we're going to be covering this on the podcast next week. We're going to book out the next 10 years of the X-Men because Kevin Feige says he has a 10-year plan for the X-Men. And we'll talk about kind of what that means, what that could look like, how we would want to do it. And I'll probably do a separate video on that. But I think it was more interesting kind of how Kevin Feige was talking about how he doesn't want the MCU to become homework. What does that mean? It means that if they're coming out with, say, 3 live action shows and 2 movies every year, you need to watch them all. Plus, they're going to be coming out with some animated stuff. So, this year, for example, we started with Your Friendly Neighborhood Spider-Man. Then we had Captain America Brave New World. Then we had Daredevil Born Again. Then we had Thunderbolts Asterisk. Then we have Ironheart, followed by Fantastic Four First Steps, Eyes of Wakanda, Marvel Zombies, and Wonder Man. That's 9 different things that you could be watching that are Marvel related this year. And it's hard to know as a viewer, and I keep on saying and a lot, Kevin Feige realizes this. It's a lot of work to keep up. Let's just say you watched all the movies, 3 movies. That's doable because they're spread out throughout the year. But if you feel like you have to watch every single show, when the average time run for Daredevil Born Again episodes was, say, 45 minutes, let's say that's true for both Wonder Man, which I think that one could be shorter, and Ironheart, which I won't be surprised if they are about 45 minutes. That's a lot of content. And that's a lot of content without major breaks to it. And I do believe it was kind of a smart call to say that. Because originally the MCU didn't feel like homework. And for me personally, it still doesn't feel like homework. I love the MCU, but I totally understand why it may for some people. Let's talk about the first 3 phases versus these current 3 phases. We're just through finishing up the second phase, so phase 5, since they didn't restart the numbering, of this multiverse saga, which has been 4, 5, and we'll be kicking off with 6 with Fantastic Four First Steps. In the first one, they didn't know what was going to be coming. They didn't know how successful this would be, especially when they did Iron Man and Captain America and Thor, those first 3 movies. They weren't sure, do we have a hit on our hand? And how do we want to tie them together? Obviously, the theory would be, let's create some sort of Avengers thing. But then, beyond that, all right, are we continuing this on further? And that led to the creation of the Infinity Saga. Now, I'm sure in the back of Kevin Feige's head, there was this idea of, this would be great if we can turn out a whole universe, a whole saga, which culminates in this Infinity Stone event. And by the time Avengers came out, they knew how successful the movies they had were. So all of that kind of comes together, but every movie itself is fairly standalone, separate. Now, for example, you watch all the Iron Man movies. If you watch Iron Man 3, you're definitely going to be missing out on some stuff. But you could just watch all the Iron Man movies. You don't have to see the end credit scene from Iron Man with Thor's hammer in it because that's not relevant. They cover that with Thor. If you decide, I just want to watch the Thor movies, you can do that. And you get the story. Now, eventually, yeah, there are probably other major moments that you need to watch, say Infinity War and Endgame, to truly get what's happening in Thor Love and Thunder fully, at least somewhat. But for the most part, you're still going to be able to get that whole story. You might be like, okay, who are the Guardians? But there are also not major players in there. And that one actually is in the next phase. I think after Endgame, Kevin Feige and the team, particularly directed by Bob Chapek, about getting a lot of content out fast, looked at it and went, where do we want to end? We want to end at Secret Wars. We want to end with this multiverse coming together. We know that we're getting the Fox X-Men back in, so we want to be able to bring them in kind of a cool spot in a cool way. And they worked backwards. They worked backwards from there to figure out the previous movies. And I think Ant-Man and the Wasp: Quantumania is a great example of this. They were like, okay, we need to have a Kang variant show up at some point in time. Okay, Quantumania, let's put him in the quantum realm. I think that's an interesting thing. Then let's build a movie around that. And that's arguably where Marvel went off the rails slightly, and where they're trying to course correct. And a lot of this came from us fans as well. We went back and looked at everything from phase 1 to phase 3, and we're like, oh, okay, what ties in to Infinity War? How are they setting things up? What Easter eggs, breadcrumbs were they dropping in to let us know, ooh, Infinity Saga, we're going to have this coming down the line. But some of those, had to be undone. And I think that's the way that Marvel should be treating it going forward. And I think that's the way that Kevin Feige is talking about, where it should be less homework or no homework. Yes, you may need to have seen a thing or two leading up to the events of whatever the next big movie is for the X-Men. But right now, and we'll get to my analogy here soon, right now it feels like we're expected to have watched more coming up to the end of the multiverse saga here. And it feels like, to some, and even sometimes, did I really want to watch Secret Invasion? Not with how it turned out. But it feels like work to keep up with it when it should feel like entertainment. So, how is this getting fixed? And this is where my analogy comes in. In phase 1, 2, and 3, the Infinity Saga. So I'm just going to go Infinity Saga, Multiverse Saga. We go on a road trip. And we stop at a ton of cool places along the way. Some of them less cool than others. Hulk, Thor: The Dark World, for example. But we're stopping along places that are supposed to be interesting because they are interesting, not because of the destination. And that's what a great road trip is. Yeah, there's going to be something cool at the end, and you hope that it lives up to kind of the hype. But a good road trip, you're taking your time and you're traveling along the way and enjoying the stops. And the stops don't lead you further down the path. They are meant to be enjoyed for themselves. That makes sense? Let's talk about the Multiverse Saga and why that one feels different. This is some of the reality of what was done and some of the expectation from us as fans as to what was being done. The expectation and what was being done to some extent was this idea of here's our destination. We're going to go on a road trip to that destination, but every stop along the way should provide something to further us in understanding our destination. And it became about that destination and where we end up across everything, and the focus was lost on enjoying it for what it is. No stop ever felt fully, and there are exceptions to this, but there was always this nagging thing in the back of your head of like, oh, I have to watch this to see what it sets up for the Multiverse Saga. So it became about the destination. And what I hope with the 10 years of X-Men is that, well, Kevin Feige has it mapped out to some extent, and we're going to be talking about, like I said, how we would map that out in this upcoming week's podcast, that everything is much more loosely held. And I want to give kind of this example of what I mean. In Thor, when we are in Asgard in the hall where there's all those different treasures and things like that, we see the Infinity Gauntlet. In Thor Ragnarok, Hela knocks it over and says, that's fake. So why do I bring that up as an example? Because the Infinity Gauntlet is a great Easter egg. That's a fun thing to spot as a fan of the comics. But it also wasn't put in there to be a super, oh yeah, that tells us everything going forward. That was just a fun Easter egg, and they had to redact it, basically, to be like, yeah, that's a fake one. How they knew about Infinity Gauntlets? Don't know. But this is what I'm talking about with the X-Men and with Marvel going forward, is create your best film possible. And we see this, I think, with the Thunderbolts. They created the best film possible, told a deeply emotional, character-driven story with good comedy and solid action. Good action, I would say. And then with the post-credit scene, they talked about what they were building towards. And if that can be done with the X-Men, what that means is we're building a really strong movie. We care about the singular project we are working on at this point. And yes, Kevin Feige may have some things of, can we toss in that Easter egg or that little detail? Can we add a scene where somebody says this? But it's always going to be about that movie first. And if ties into the final thing. That's great. But that final thing, until you're down to it, until you're starting to write that script, is still just the fun location at the end. The details are not solidified and hardened to the point where you can't change them, where it's bashing up against a brick wall, for another metaphor. Instead, it's this target that you're working towards at the end, but how you get there is as important. And this is where, really my road trip analogy is why I want to use it. It's as important, it's more important that the journey and the stops on that journey are awesome than it leads to and has built to this proper massive thing. Because if we think about the Infinity Saga, yeah, it built with Avengers, where we got to see a tiny bit of Thanos. And then we got a little nod to it again. And then there was a little bit from Thor Ragnarok. But for the most part, all of these movies, and the success rate wasn't 100%, but all these movies were standalone. They were meant to be good within the character series that they were telling. Not to super play into this final moment. Because we'll still believe and be excited for that final moment when it happens, when this big event, when we reach the end of our road trip, our current road trip, because let's face it, I don't want these road trips to stop. But when we reach the end of our current road trip, that should be exciting enough in and of itself without having had everything else trying to build into its excitement beforehand. So that was fairly long-winded. Hopefully that made sense. I'm excited for what this means, because if there's one thing I'm very confident with Kevin Feige, is that he's a smart individual, and he knows to some extent what went wrong in the multiverse saga. There are plenty of things beyond his control. Jonathan Majors' legal issues, the pandemic, the war between Russia and Ukraine. All those things impacted how Marvel was able to do their work and to tell their stories. They had to change stories because of real-world events. They had to change how they film stuff because of real-world events. And then I also put a little bit on the directive to produce a lot of stuff fast. Kevin Feige even had talked about how he was feeling burned out, or not necessarily how he was feeling burned out, but how he was hard to get a hold of when people had questions, because there were so many projects, so many things working at once. So I think it is a really smart move to slow down. And the great thing about slowing down is that gives us a real chance to enjoy those stops along the way of the road trip to whatever awesome thing is going to be at the end. But let me know your thoughts down in the comment section below. If you enjoy this content, please give the video a thumbs up. Like I said, we're going to be talking about how we'd map out 10 years of Marvel's X-Men leading to whatever event would end that on this next week's podcast. You can find our review as well as some comments on Kevin Feige's interview, reveal of Thunderbolts, asterisks, and our thoughts on Kevin Feige's interview on our podcast here on YouTube. Click onto the channel, subscribe if you haven't already, and then Click that notification bell to know when new videos come out. Finally, click on the podcast tab and check out the podcast episodes there. Or you can search for 10 Minute Marvel wherever you get your friendly neighborhood podcasts from. But with that, we will see you next time.